What up, guys? New topic for Ryan on gaming. This is a pretty good one. This one comes from Oshim on PS, and he says, "Hey Ryan, I'm a subscriber to your YouTube channel, and I've got a question for you. Not exactly broad gaming as it just is PlayStation, but how different do you think the turnout of the seventh generation would have been if the PS3 cheaper out of the gate? Meaning no backwards compatibility from the start, none of the card readers, anything that they could have done to cut corners to make the console cheaper, closer to $400. Do you think it could have matched the 360 quicker, and that all those third-party exclusive games that Sony had lost, Sony could have helped secure? How different would the 7th gen have been? Also, I hope they extend the maximum friends list so I can send you a friend request at some point." Sorry, but it's stuck at 2,000 friends, and my friends have been full forever. If you do try to add me, I'm sorry, guys, my friends is full. I cannot, there's nothing I can do about that. But I do like your question a lot. How different would the 7th generation of consoles have been if Sony had made the PlayStation 3 more affordable by cutting all the corners that they ended up doing eventually? Because that's the one thing to look at this, right? PlayStation 3 came out, and it was this big piece of chunky hardware that had an SD card slot, the memory stick Pro Duo slot, a compact flash, the 4 USB ports, backwards compatibility, and it was a big piece of expensive hardware that ultimately Sony actually sold at a loss. It took around $800 for Sony to manufacture and sell one PlayStation 3, and they were selling each one at about $600 to $500, depending on the 20 or 60 gigabyte model. And eventually it did get to that point, right? They took out backwards compatibility, they took out the card readers, they lowered the USB ports. So it's like they eventually did these things. It's just a matter of what you're posing is that, what if they did this from the start? What if the PlayStation 3 was $400 from the start and things like that? Now, the one thing to note is that more than likely Sony, even if Sony had taken all those things out of the PlayStation 3, they probably still would have lost money on PlayStation 3 because the hardware was still relatively new. The one thing to keep in mind, what you're saying, is that you're not really mentioning anything in terms of the architecture. The PlayStation 3 architecture would essentially still be the same, much like what you're getting at here. Even if they took out backwards compatibility or the card readers or all that stuff to make the system more affordable, it still would have been using the cell processor. It still would have been very difficult to develop for, and that's ultimately why Sony had such a huge problem in terms of like getting developers onto the platform to support it, not only because the install base wasn't so big, but because it was legitimately difficult to work on that hardware and to actually get something up and running on it, to get an engine working on it, and to actually release your damn game. And that's why a lot of PlayStation 3 ports were quite poor. They weren't bug tested a lot as greatly and things like that. Now, of course, there's always this discrepancy of like, well, the developers that worked on PlayStation 3 early on didn't give enough effort into it, or Sony didn't work closely enough with third parties, because a lot of Sony's first-party development studios did great things with PlayStation 3 even early on, which tells you that, if Sony is there to provide the support for the developers, then they can release good PlayStation 3 games without a bunch of bugs and problems inside of it. But that is the point, right? Is that the PS3 still had the cell processor, so Sony still would have had a pretty big issue in terms of like third-party exclusives and getting good quality third-party games on the PlayStation 3 right off the bat. But if the system was more affordable, it certainly would have sold better. I think a lot of people, and that's the thing, right, is that when PlayStation 3 came out, Sony had this big attitude going into the 7th generation of consoles, going, you know what, even if our system's $600, we did the PlayStation 2, we did the PlayStation, we are PlayStation, like, we are awesome, we're gonna make an incredible expensive piece of hardware, and our fans will support us, our fans will buy our crap. And that's what Sony learned, is that when they sent out the PS3 and this big expensive piece of hardware, they learned that people won't just buy their hardware because of that. They had a hard time with PlayStation 3 and selling it and everything, because it was expensive and all that jazz. So certainly, yeah, if it was more affordable, if it was closer to like $400, they would have been able to sell more PlayStation 3s. Would have been able to, catch up on 360 quicker? Yeah, more than likely, because that's the whole idea, right? If it's cheaper, more people are going to buy it. So, yeah, it would have caught up to 360 quicker. But ultimately, I don't think it would have had a huge role in terms of, like, third parties and developers and the actual games for the system, because the core issue was the cell processor. And granted, the cell processor was still very interesting. A lot of people ended up liking it near the end of the console cycle. I mean, because it was such a powerful piece of equipment. Once you could really harness the cell processor, you could do some really incredible things with it. And to this day, there's a small community of people and developers and things that they're obsessed with the cell processor and learning how to emulate it and learning how to work on it more and tap more power out of it and things like that. So the cell processor is really the big contingency here. The big kind of story about it is that you know, what really would have happened if the PS3 didn't have the cell processor? I think that's a bigger question. Not only would not only is it like, hey, what if the PS3 was more affordable, but what if it also didn't have the cell processor? Then how would the 7th generation of consoles turned out? And I think that's where you probably would have had a much different story. A system that was easy to develop on, that was affordable, and so people would just jump right into it immediately. Games would come out on it just fine. I think that's where PS3 would have been a completely different story, which is funny because all those things that we're mentioning is what the PlayStation 4 is right now. Easy to develop on. It was very affordable when it came out, or $400, still $400, but it's more affordable than $600. That's what the PlayStation 4 became. So, if anything, that kind of sets the timeline of why we now have an awesome PlayStation 4, is that the PlayStation 3 was kind of crappy when it came out. But even still, you got to keep in mind 360 did have a whole year lead on the market, so that's why it did have close relationships with developers, and you did see all those game exclusives for 360, and 360 was development priority because all these third-party developers had their engines running on 360. They were used to working on 360 at that point, so it's pretty cut clear why 360 did have that lead, and why it probably would have still held a pretty reasonable lead if Sony had done PlayStation 3 a little bit differently. But yeah, that's the thing that I would say, is that certainly Sony would have caught up quicker. They probably would have had slightly better relationships with developers, even with the cell processor, but they still would have been falling short, because 360 did have that year lead, and that really does go a long way, especially with third-party developers. Anyway, that's about it for this topic of Ryan on Gaming. I hope you all enjoyed it. PSN Oshim, thank you for the submission. It was a really good submission. This is actually, you sent this one a while ago, 2015. Wow, 2005. That'd be a very long time away. Yeah, guys, like I said, I'm sorry if it takes me that long to get to your topic, but as I always tell you guys, if you send a good topic, I will screen cap it and I will get to it at some point. And Oshim, I'm sorry it took me this long to get to your topic, buddy. Yeah, that's all I got. Sorry. But don't let that discourage you from sending a topic. I want you to send one right now, and then build a time machine, go a little bit into the future, and then see if I did your topic. And more than likely, you'll see in your subscription feed that your topic's in there, because I got you.